Pleasure to introduce Willi Goetschel as our first or inaugural speaker of the second year of the Vanderbilt and Modern Philosophy colloquium. And hopefully down the road, we'll be able to meet in person one of these days. I have met Willi, I don't know if you remember, in April 1990, I looked it up yesterday, at the second international colloquium in critical theory that was devoted to Walter Benjamin. It was convened by Rodolphe Gachet at SUNY Buffalo many, many years ago. I think you were still a postdoc in Columbia.
No, I was visiting assistant professor, what a long name, at
Columbia, yeah.
College.
Okay, okay, yeah, anyway, but that was like, we're going back, so we are going back to 1990s. That's a substantial amount of time. And since then, we've been in contact ever since, both in terms of work on the history of philosophy, in particular, German Jewish philosophy, but German philosophy and critical theory, but of course, all dating back to my good friend Spinoza. And so Spinoza is a pivotal, for good and ill, a pivotal figure here. Willi is probably is a professor of philosophy and Germanistic, I guess. I don't know what they call it now. Studies in Toronto, who teaches Jewish thought, German Enlightenment, idealism, critical theory, and social and political theory. And he is probably, I think, to my knowledge, but then I'm not an expert, the leading Heine scholar today. I mean, in terms of his work, just a number of his book publications are, the most recent one is Heine and Critical Theory in 2019, and Spinoza's Modernity, Mendelssohn, Lessing, and Heine, 2004, Constituting Critique, Kant's Writing as Critical Praxis, 1994, and he has edited the collected works of Hermann Levin Goldschmidt from 1992, and Goldschmidt is not known here, but he is quite a figure in Swiss critical theory, as I understand it. Willi received his MPhil from Universität Zurich and PhD from Harvard. So without much ado, I'm really looking forward to the talk again. I will introduce Willi to you.
Well, thank you so much, Edith, for first the introduction and also for giving me with your colleagues at Vanderbilt this very nice chance for me to test run one of my core sections in a book I am preparing on difference and alterity in early modern philosophy. So I'm really pleased to do that. And while we all complain about the problems that teaching on Zoom produces, I'm also appreciate the positive aspects, even if there only may be few, of technology and the chance to internationally reach out to some people, because this gives me a chance that I couldn't do just going to my lecture hall here or anywhere else. So the subject for today is the difference and alterity in Spinoza. And you may think that I'm going to square the circle. I'm not. I'm doing it geometrically, we could say. So Spinoza's philosophical trajectory, I would like to argue, is to be seen in a larger context of rethinking difference and alterity, a context that in modernity spans from Machiavelli and Montaigne to Moses Mendelssohn, Marx, and Simmel to Derrida. My interest in contextualizing Spinoza with some more comprehensive depth of focus is not meant to serve some presentist demands, but on the contrary, to respond to the need to rethink difference and alterity in a theoretically as well as historically more thorough manner. While difference talk has become fashionable and most recently problematically, if not outright dangerously, re-instrumentalized by the political spectrum occasionally way off our intellectual Geiger counters, there is a certain urgency to reclaim difference and alterity as not just philosophically legitimate or even relevant concerns, but to commit more attentively to their critical significance. This requires, among other things, tracking the discourse in philosophy on difference and alterity all the way back to its emergence in early modernity. My interest is then not just to examine in Spinoza resources for reconceptualizing this issue, but to arrive at a better grasp of the challenges we face ourselves today. Returning to Spinoza can so lead not just to a better understanding of his philosophical project, but also shed light on the exigencies of the philosophical discourse and protocols under which we operate. I would like to begin a brief discussion of the only dream Spinoza reports in a letter to a friend in 1664. It's letter number 17. Spinoza mentions the dream to discuss the question of the meaning of dreams in response to his friend's suggestions that dreams are portents. The inquiry came in the context of his friend's Peter Balling's loss of his son at a young age. Balling was wondering whether a dream he had preceding his son's death might have been a premonition. In his response, Spinoza seeks to comfort his friend, sharing a dream of his own to show how dreams are products of our imagination and tell us something about how our minds work. The dream goes like this. One morning at the threshold of sleep and awakening, Spinoza sees a black Brazilian, maybe a slave, looking intently at him. A strange unsettling dream encounter or hallucination. What is important in the context of my talk today is the scene of this dream or hallucination transpires. I think we can read this letter as a key study of how alterity comes into the picture. I say consciously comes into the picture because to say enters consciousness would be problematic, describing a scene navigating the threshold between the conscious and the unconscious. And the fact, as Etienne Balibar has shown, the concept of consciousness is not yet around, only going to be coming up in 1690 or so. Spinoza's model of the self, to use somewhat problematic and historically anachronistic term when speaking about Spinoza, this Spinoza's model of the self is not self-enclosed, but porous and permeable. As we will see, for Spinoza, there is no simple way of distinguishing interiority from exteriority, self from other. We could say that the dream image Spinoza invokes in his letter powerfully challenges, if not suspends, any notion of a possessive individualism. Instead, the dream image suggests a notion of self and others that carefully navigates the rock of individualism and the hard place of collectivism. More precisely, Spinoza offers here an entry point to reimagine the relation between self and others as the scene where the modern I emerges as the site of intersecting and conflicting aspects, a model of reciprocal implications that registers resistance to a binary. Spinoza's ethics performs a paradigm shift whose far-reaching consequences are often overlooked, not just with regard to a philosophically more rigorous understanding of the critical significance of immanence, human understanding, and the life of the affects, but also for the way it advances a new way to address and embrace difference and alterity. Given Spinoza's background and cultural and historical context, we can appreciate that his interest in a new way of understanding difference was not just an existential, but also an epistemological motivator, as was his intimate grasp concerning the fluidity of identity formation. It was not just that he encountered the occasion for this challenge on a daily basis at home, on the street, and in the city of Amsterdam, one of the leading commercial trading hubs of the period, whose mercantile success radiated through society as an irresistible modernizing force. He was also intimately familiar with it through his most personal experiences, growing up and then leaving the Jewish community for a number of various social circles. But what is new and different in the case of Spinoza is that he developed a way of approaching difference no longer as a problem, fault, lack, or failure, but instead as a formative and constitutive feature of life. There was nothing wrong in his eyes with difference or being different, and it therefore did not require goodwill or self-sacrifice to advocate tolerance, an ultimately constrained form of assimilating alterity. His theological political treatise single-handedly showed to be obsolete. Rather, recognition of the difference of others and acceptance of their alterity was not just an ethical imperative, but was so in the way Spinoza understood the meaning of ethics, a profoundly epistemological and philosophical necessity. At the heart of Spinoza's intervention stands the idea that all there is occurs on a plane of radical immanence where hierarchies and preordained structures no longer apply. Essences are defined by the effects only. That's one of his major redefinitions. Essences are defined by the effects only. There are no ontological double floors. Everything that is interconnected. An approach that does away with any sort of ontological or other kinds of privileged pockets. In short, Spinoza's is an all the way through democratic conception, if by democratic is meant a conception in the sense of complete reciprocity of causal relations, of equally entitled modes of existence of one substance. Spinoza has traditionally been considered a proponent of substance metaphysics, privileging above all identity over difference, assimilating everything to an all-absorbing notion of all and oneness. Given Spinoza's substance monism, the unifying principle of his ontological framework seems to leave no room for difference and otherness, collapsing alterity into the homogeneity of the totally identical. At least that's how many people read him. While Leibniz's monadological scheme is a direct response to this concern, Leibniz's approach, however, leads to the kind of problems down the line whose theological political implications Spinoza seeks to opt out. Predicated on the plurality of substance, Leibniz domesticates difference under the sign of a preordained harmony that returns teleological and a particular form of theological thinking to philosophy from which Spinoza seeks to liberate it. While difference becomes in Leibniz a concern central to his philosophy, he relegates difference to the level of monads, which are for Leibniz different in substance rather than in function, that is, relation to each other. Leibniz extends difference for Spinoza operative between modes into the nature of substance itself. The contrast with Leibniz helps highlight the critical thrust of Spinoza's project to develop a concept of difference that resists the domestication of otherness in terms of mere variation of monadological sameness. Alternatively labeled acosmic, in his outlook by Maimon and Hegel, Spinoza has been accused of turning a blind eye on the diversity of life. He thought to represent a bad case of ontological asphyxia. This impression has taken hold to such a degree that it continues to inform textbook accounts in naturalized form. And I'm not going to treat you of examples of that because that would take too much time, although it would be humorous. At closer examination, however, I argue Spinoza's substance monism, that is his insistence on the oneness of substance, provides a unique point of departure for recognizing difference as a feature that informs our existence in a central and constitutive manner. In Spinoza, difference is no longer cast based on distinctions which imply a privative or negative sense of exclusion, but on the contrary, on a distinction that operates immanently and is fully modal and relational. Resolutely starting with a consistently immanent model, Spinoza conceives of any form of difference as intrinsically part of this model rather than what excludes it. This radical turn in theorizing difference has profound consequences. In breaking new grounds to approach the singularity of the individual in the context of the emerging new sciences, whose unified view of nature requires a new philosophical thinking, differences come now into view as no longer substance contingent, but rather in terms of the interactions and relations producing them, that is, as reciprocal chain interactions. Seen by Spinoza as complex composites that constantly require regeneration and are consequently in continual exchange with others on whose difference they rely, even exist, individuals in the singularity of their existence come into view as fundamentally different from the modern subject imagined as homogeneous and self-identical. Rather, in Spinoza, this new individual is better understood with regard to its trans-individual features, to use Balibar's repurposing of the term introduced by Sismondi. Recognizing differences and antagonisms as functions of relations rather than ontologically determined features, Spinoza lifts the onus of traditionally negative implications, turning critical attention to the empowering aspects of difference. In order to do this, he moves away from granting difference any quasi-ontic purchase, a move that allows him to focus on the functional nexus in which difference emerges no longer as a deficiency, lack, or privation, but instead as a relational aspect inherent to the modality that defines all things in our reach of cognitive comprehension. In short, his ethics outlines a framework in which difference emerges as function of a system to which it is integral. Difference, thus, is no longer negatively cast in terms of insufficiency or deviance, be it of any ontological, epistemological, political, religious, or logical sort. Instead, Spinoza situates difference squarely within the design of life as integral part and function of its makeup, and without any imputation of any sort of lack or negative implication. Comprehending difference in terms of a function of how modes relate, Spinoza casts difference no longer as any sort of property of a thing, but in terms of how things relate to each other. In other words, in the case of Spinoza, it is precisely the starting point of his substance metaphysics that foregrounds the shift to consider singular things as particular modal forms of the attributes of the one and only substance that makes it possible to move from a paradigm of substance to that of function. This insight into the relational quality that informs difference is not just a felicitous consequence, but goes to the heart of the way Spinoza constructs his approach from the bottom up. A consequence of its monist position is that all that we can recognize becomes recognizable in complex and dynamic relationships with other parts. Because there is no exterior to be distinguished from an interior, all that exists in relationships manifesting itself by way of functions of difference. While substance underpins all that exists, it is accessible to knowledge. Spinoza's epistemology, while substance underpins all that exists, it is accessible to knowledge. Spinoza's epistemology redirects the discourse on difference to the tertiary level, that is away from substance and its two attributes, extension and thought, relegating it to the level of the modes in which we encounter them. In doing so, Spinoza gives the discourse an unprecedented turn, using the very concept of substance, God, or nature to assign to the modes of the attributes of thought and extension the operative functional status. It is remarkably this radically immanent turn that allows for a conception of difference internal to the system's design, making difference from the start a feature inherent to the function of the system as a whole, rather than singling out any of its components or elements as exclusively defining features or positing any intrinsic difference as far as the substance is concerned. Theorized this way, as a function rather than intrinsic quality or property, Spinoza's substance metaphysics moves away from an ontic fixation and instead allows difference to emerge as a modal and relational feature from which arises a dynamic, that is, relational view of diversity. Spinoza's, at first glance, seemingly static conception ultimately shows its dynamic thrust, suggesting inclusion rather than exclusion, marginalization and ontological ranking as philosophically mandated. This turn at the heart of Spinoza's ethics is not coincidental, but agrees with Spinoza's social, political, and ethical concerns. In fact, these concerns assume more distinct contours and critical momentum once the project of recasting difference in the ethics is fully appreciated. To track this turn, we shall look at some of the key features guiding Spinoza and how they make it possible to address difference and alterity as integral part of his critical agenda to redesign metaphysical discourse. In Spinoza, this doesn't occur as an afterthought, I argue, but by placing this concern at the center of his intervention. So first, I want to look at that, how it plays out in the distinction of part and whole. Before we look at how this plays out in Spinoza's approach to rethinking what is an individual, a body and a human individual in particular, it might be helpful to consider the way Spinoza theorizes the relationship between the whole and its parts. Spinoza discusses this relationship in a letter to Heinrich Oldenburg in 1665 in letter 32. In this letter, the distinction between parts and the whole is addressed as a distinction an observer makes from the position she or he occupies, or one should maybe say it, I don't know, given the observing subject, as we will see, within a system this observer occupies within a system they observe, but of which they are also a part. Spinoza's example here is a worm in the bloodstream. As this worm observes, it cannot extricate itself from the system it observes as the standpoint of perspective. In the example, a tellingly floating and fluctuating one, if we want to vary on Montaigne, from which it observes is already part of the process of observing. While each particular thing might serve and be viewed as a part, the whole of which it can be considered a part can in turn be understood as a part of a larger whole, and so on ad infinitum. The limit case is substance, in whose oneness everything that exists is figured in a particular mode. The distinction between substance and modes is mediated here through the attributes. Anything that exists can be grasped by us only by way of being expressed under the two attributes, matter and thought, res extensa and res cogitans. This means that the distinction between part and whole cannot be followed all the way to the substance. Such a reduction is blocked at the level of attributes, as well as at the level of their particular forms of modification. More precisely, as far as substance is concerned, the distinction between part and whole does not apply. Right here at the point of the conception of substance as the cause from which all that exists issues, difference can no longer be observed because at this level, it is ontologically speaking non-existent. At this level, there is just one and only one substance, nature, God, or ultimate cause of which all is a part. With this, difference assumes a different quality than is usually associated with the term. Difference now assumes a positive quality as it comes into view as a part of the dynamic issuing forth from substance as what connects, unites, as it differentiates and separates the various modes in which difference manifests itself. Difference, in other words, is now no longer the effect of a lack or deprivation, but arises as the result of a network of relations all things share as their ultimate matrix. As such, it defines them paradoxically as both at the same time, in certain aspects at the same while in other aspects as functionally other. They are all modes, and as modes they're indistinct as far as their substance is concerned. Their difference is perspectival only. This has important consequences for the matter of hermeneutic engagement in general and the question of the particular positionality of the philosopher in particular. Just like part and whole, difference is in the eye of the beholder, or more precisely in the epistemic relationship observation creates. Spinoza's decision to ground his line of argument in an irreducible, all-comprising whole brings out the epistemological situation that any form of understanding rests ultimately on the distinction it makes, that is, the differences it therefore makes. In Niklas Luhmann's parlance, we could say there is no meta level to distinguish distinctions within a system that is outside of the observation of the immanence of a system under observation. Like Spinoza's observer worm in the bloodstream, difference is a function of an observation that is of the distinction we make. And now I come to this section on body and matter. And if you want to make sure the handout is available, so the first text is coming up, and I may not read them out all the time since you have them on the handout, but I may, depending on the time, I may. While Spinoza holds substance to be one, a single all-embracing unity of which everything is a part, bodies and matter are not conceived in terms of the sameness of the one and only substance, but as modes of extension. As modes, they are differentiated by movement and location, and as a consequence, also temporally so. With regard to bodies, then, difference arises as a dynamic relational feature rather than an essential mark of bodies themselves, because, as you remember, they're all of the same substance. Difference is a function of positionality and movement, and so relative to other bodies, and that's text number 1 from the proposition 13 of Ethics 2, dilemma 1. Bodies are distinguished from one another by reason of motion and rest, speed and slowness, and not by reason of substance. Further, more complex bodies, like human bodies, for example, are themselves composites composed of various parts. Differentiation is consequently an internal affair. A number of postulates following this postulate 13 of Ethics 2 make the following point, and I just picked the 3 that are relevant for here. 1, the human body is composed of a great many individuals of different natures, diverse naturae, each of which is highly composite. 3rd, the individuals composing the human body and consequently the human body itself are affected by external bodies in very many ways. And 4th, the human body to be preserved requires a great many other bodies by which it is, as it were, continually regenerated. Bodies are not only located at different locations, but also internally differentiated by the different parts of which they are composites. What defines a human being as individual is the interplay of its parts that makes it a coherent unit. There is no meta level that would allow to introduce a higher order criterion for difference. Differences between individuals are only relative, relating to their variously individual compositions and positionality. They don't relate to each other outside the modes in which they occur. They can't. The differences are therefore what they share, as it were a quasi-perspectival effect of the relational interplay of their correlation, and therefore irreducible to one or the other only. Consequently, an individual is for Spinoza relationally configured. That is, an individual is an individual only in relation to other things and individuals necessary for its sustenance and regeneration. So it is like there's no such thing as a finite individual for him. As composites, individuals are open-ended and dynamic, that is, open to change and transformation. While they might be distinguished by strength, size, power, and complexity, their mutual relations are flexible and subject to change, as individuals are potentially unstable, dynamic entities in flux that recombine in any possible form and way. This is true whether an individual is viewed as a composite making up of what we call a body, a human body, a person, a group, state, or social, political, religious, or any other collective entity. For Spinoza, they are all individuals. Rudimentary as this model first might be, and that's also part of its charm, its ramifications are momentous already at the level of sheer corporeality. For following it, difference comes into view as a dynamic feature that is modal, that is non-substantial, relational, and dynamic, yet reciprocally determined through all, yet reciprocally determined, though always in flux and motion. So I skipped the thought part. We can come back to that if you want, and just go straight to the affects, which of course is also part of the thought. And the question is how we can distinguish them. So now that's the last real part that I want to look at in his ethics, how the affects work. If at the level of the physical understanding of bodies, Spinoza's approach complicates the matter with a twist that highlights the vital significance of difference with regard to the basic material necessities bodies depend on to sustain their existence. The central role of difference and alterity assumes its rest more prominently at the heart of the ethics' complex and differentiated account of the affects. Spinoza's account of the sheer range of the quality and graduation of affects offers the picture of an infinite spectrum of various shades that showcase a diversity in defiance of any desire to determine a definitive concept of human nature, oblivious to internal differentiation. In Spinoza, difference is the birthmark of the affects. Affects originate from our body and mind and are formed by the way we relate to other bodies. So affects are a function of the body. Affects are a function, they occur in a particular individual and are therefore each time configured in a singular way. And now I come to the excerpt 3. Spinoza defines affects as affections of the body by which the body's power of acting is increased and diminished, aided or restrained, and at the same time, the ideas of these affections. The singularity of each body is defined by its rich and complex relationship to other bodies that define each differentially distinguished from all others. While the conatus of each thing defines its essence of or power, this power or conatus is specific and singular to each individual thing or body. It is potentially continuous with another thing or body, but in some respects it is always different for the simple reason that all things are for us conceptually intelligible only as singular modes of one or the other attribute of the one substance, rather than per unmediated recourse to substance as substance itself. But Spinoza says also affects are to some degree externally caused. So there's a further differentiation. They're internally differentiated, but also externally. Affects are and they are so to the degree they are defined by the various external objects that cause them. And here we go, another infinity loop with number 4. Different men can be affected differently by one and the same object, and one and the same man can be affected differently at different times by one and the same object. And then we skip to the next, to number 5. Text number 5, there are as many species of joy, sadness, and desire, and consequently of each affect composed of these, like vacillations of mind, or derived from them, like love, hate, hope, fear, etc., as there are species of objects by which we are affected. So Spinoza is famously known for reducing all affects, almost like Freud, to these 3 master affects. But the fact is, it's actually the other way around. They are just like the first stops on an infinite range of differentiations where we have all kinds of things that ever differentiate into different unending singularities. As a result, the external causes of affects are potentially endless, limited only by the number of so-called species of objects, a qualification Spinoza, however, doesn't describe any further, but that clearly indicates the way the diversity of affects is proliferated into ever further differentiation. Singularity is so functionally produced and maintained. Again, it's not, singularity is not substantial, it's functional, relational. Consequently, differentiation is squarely built into the dynamic interaction between all things. Spinoza summarizes his point in the demonstration to proposition 33 in Ethics 4. Well, I don't know whether we have, I think we have time to read it. The nature or essence of the affects cannot be explained through our essence or nature alone, but must be defined by the power that is by the nature of external causes compared with our own. That is why there are as many species of each affect as there are species of objects by which we are affected. That is why men or humans are affected differently by one and the same object, and to that extent disagree in nature. And finally, that is also why one and the same human, again, is affected, the same human is affected differently toward the same object, and to that extent is changeable. The diversity of affects proliferates thus based on how different things might cause different affects in different people in different situations and contexts, you could add at different times, mushrooming into an infinite range of idiosyncratically individualized variations of affective responses, which mark each as singular and unique by virtue of the endless complexities of the affects dynamics. Okay, so now we are through the sort of more complicated metaphysical niceties, and we can get a little bit more general with these sections on self and interrelationality. Given Spinoza's view on bodies, affects, and the production of knowledge, it is barely surprising that there is no notion of an independent epistemological subject and a stable self-identical self of the Cartesian or Lockean sort. To account for the particular way in which Spinoza addresses the question of the individuality of human beings, Etienne Balibar has suggested to use the term transindividual, first in 1997 and in a very sophisticated further development in a book that was translated in English last year. In her recent paper also, with the title From the Self to Oneself, Subject and Interiority in Spinoza, that is also just a few years old, Chantal Jacquet adds some interesting additional comments on Spinoza's particular approach to the question of self and subject and self. Following Balibar and Jacquet, it becomes clear that Spinoza doesn't see the self as a separate independent entity, and the rigid distinction between oneself and another has become epistemologically questionable. Jacquet even goes so far as to suggest that upon closer examination, we can see that for Spinoza, and she actually says that, I quote, the self is also an other. Now, if you think of that sentence and go back to the dream that I started with, this becomes very non-trivial. Her observations are suggestively in line with Balibar's. As a consequence of Spinoza's consistently immanent approach, the distinction between inside and outside no longer applies. A point also made in a paper just published by Julie Klein, who is here with us, called Spinoza's Meditations on Life and Death. You can see how we now have come full circle following Spinoza. If the self is more like a bundle of various relations with oneself and others, the function of interrelationality comes into view as one of fundamental importance. In Spinoza's universe, the locution "all that is in God," or "all that is God," expresses not just a statement with pointed theological political implications, but also a point about how everything is deeply related to everything else in an infinite continuum where everything is understood to be part of an all-embracing whole. Consequently, the human individual is figured as an interrelating self, that is, a self that exists only as a function of relations with other bodies and other selves. Aurelia Armstrong's argument about Spinoza's relational conception of individuality adds to the voices of Balibar and Jacquet in an interesting way. We can then understand Spinoza's substance metaphysics as the framework for a relational account that breaks grounds for understanding difference and alterity as necessary but also relational conditions for understanding the world, matter, and human beings through the causally relational account of the only aspect we have access to, that is, the level of modes through which all thought and extension becomes intelligible to us as expressions of the one substance, God or nature. Relational thinking informs Spinoza thought not only top-down or all the way up or through. His relational approach is imbued with a liberatory thrust already at the level of the individual, or we could say now more precisely the trans-individual. As difference is a product of the relation that for Spinoza literally produces us, so is identity. But identity, we understand now, is the difference we make as we relate to others contingent on them for our own existence. And so I come to the conclusion, which is on Spinoza's politics. Spinoza's political thought articulates the framework for a politics that is steeped in a deep understanding of relationality, as we just saw it. Spinoza's political philosophy is not surprisingly then attentive to the way interhuman relations function at the various levels of the dynamics of bodies and affects. There are two prominent features that highlight how radically Spinoza commits to difference and alterity as key concerns in social and political theory. The first is Spinoza's insistence that no form of cession or transfer of rights and no social contract can establish any right to encroach on natural rights such as the freedom of speech and thought. Spinoza introduces this point programmatically first in his introduction to the theological political treatise. There he also maintains that according to the non-transferability of the right of nature, nobody can be held to live according to the nature of another. The Latin ex alterius ingenio highlights what exactly is at stake here: the recognition of everybody's particular inflection of ingenium, or nature of physical and affective composition, their desire vector of conatus, or however else one might wish to describe it, wishes to describe the interrelational or trans-individual makeup of human beings. The second feature, and related to this, is that Spinoza's anthropology is of course resolutely non-normative, as he notes a few lines earlier following a Machiavellian intuition. And I quote, Hominem ingenium varium ad modem est. The ingenium of people varies a great deal, or even is very, or even extremely, depending on how exactly you translate ad modum, different from one to the other. What this means is that there is no universally valid concept of human nature, or as the ethics field developed this, the only recourse to consensus forming discourse on the subject is the recourse to exemplars of human existence, what we today would call narratives, that might offer the right combination of effective stimulation and philosophical orientation to produce a sense of socially and politically feasible ideals to live by in a certain place and time. For this reason, Spinoza may have some preferred political order and constitution, but pointedly refrains from singling out anyone in particular as universally best suited, for the simple reason that everything depends ultimately on the particular society which a political order is supposed to suit best. This is also the reason why Spinoza recognizes the importance of consulting bodies. For difference is not only what might challenge us, but also what offers the creative resources. His political outlook is for this reason so different from much of the tradition of political philosophy. This accounts for the close affinity with Machiavelli. In agreement with Machiavelli's pragmatic approach to the vicissitudes of human character, political situations he famously files under Fortuna, Spinoza takes the insight of the radically constitutive role of difference in politics to the next level, embracing it as a feature we cannot ignore without undermining the very project of a sound political and general philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willi. Before we begin with questions, which I'd like you to just type, and then we'll be able to call you from the order in which you present your question. One thing I forgot to do at the beginning was remind you all that we still have a call for papers for VAMP. I should have done it before the session. But, and we really are looking forward to papers that are not strictly on Spinoza. We have a lot of Spinoza papers, but we'd like to have some other, if possible. We won't reject Spinoza papers, but we really are eagerly calling for papers, both from graduate students and from faculty at every level. So please consider sending abstract titles, whatever, to us. So now I would like to open this to questions. Questions, comments, anyone wants to start? Okay, Emma?
All right, I will use the hosting privileges to make everybody feel better about not going for the first question. So first of all, thank you so much. This was a great paper.
There's a problem with your mic.
Right, I suspected that could happen. Any better?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for the paper. It really brought together a lot of my interests and suggestions, and thank you very much. So I wanted to push your account a little bit further to see how reckless you are with your notion of singularity as functional and relational, which is, one that I'm very sympathetic with, and to the point that at various points, I think that Spinoza ultimately wants to think of the substance as function of the singularity of substance as functional and relational. So are you prepared and comfortable with pushing the criterion that far, or are you more conservatively keeping it exclusively for finite modes?
Could you say more what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so so in particular, I am very committed to an idea of Spinoza's metaphysics that is completely structural and relational. And I think that even the function of substance, even the singularity of substance can and should be described in functional terms rather than in ontological terms proper. So I'm thinking of the notion of self-causation that is grounding for substance, of self-inherence. All of these are relational and functional notions. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, and I'm kind of probing your account to see if your account of singularity is sympathetic to this, or you know, if your account of functional singularity is depending on the limited ontological existence of finite modes.
Yeah, I'm still not 100% sure, but like, but let me answer that way. So I think what Spinoza is not so much interested in predicating that much about substance, but he's really interested in predicating about substance in the way we can possibly do it, which is only under the attributes of thought and extension. And so therefore, and further within that only as modes. So we are already on the third level. And I think what he's doing is something not unsimilar to Luhmann, who was fascinated by Spinoza, actually, to say that whenever we do distinctions or relations, we can only do them with like inside a system. And so the inside of the system has to posit the borders as relatively reliable or because they're constituting it. And so in that way, it's a way to talk about, like, how can you talk about wholeness or like, or an entire system? If you go the way of like how substance relates to itself, you're going down a Fichtean rabbit hole, and it can become very that's clearly not what Spinoza is interested. Like that's like his Machiavellian side would pull him out of that. So like in that way, relationality has to really have another. Like otherwise, it becomes metaphorically problematic use of it. I think that would be what I would think, and what is going on there. I mean, it's clearly, or you could put it that way. I mean, it's, if you want to read Spinoza mystically, then there's a Gesamt effect or something like that that he has, and that's theological, and that's can be effectively overdetermined or whatnot, but that's not where his epistemological interest goes or so. So that, yeah.
I see that we have Juan Felipe, and after that, Julie. So Juan?
Yes, thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have maybe it is a silly question, but it's just about, it's also testing the limits of how far one can go. And once I told to a philosopher that I also conceived like of Spinoza like very, very reluctantly. So I gave him maybe a bit of an extreme example where I said, if you have a horse somewhere in the field, I could say that the horse and the field, maybe the tree beside it, conform one mode. And then he said, but you can't say that because Spinoza talks about the conatus. And then the horse would go on riding and he would separate itself from the tree. So this wouldn't be a mode, right? So Spinoza, I think, gives us a limit, maybe two limits. One is this principle of things persisting in their being. And the other one is that nothing, things don't destroy themselves, right? So then even if we talk about purely relational functions and we conceive an ontology in this way, I imagine like this white space or this substance where there are sort of centers, right? There are centers towards which affects converge and from which affects emanate. So that means that we cannot do a purely arbitrary grouping to say this is a mode. Do you agree with this view, or how do you understand these two poles that he gives between only exteriority can destroy something and things tend to persist in their being? How does that delimit this notion of singularity or self-indifference?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I read it more like Spinoza trying to set the parameters for this like immanentist discourse that he is interested in pursuing, in which those become sort of the I wouldn't see them as poles, but more like as a the setup of the framework of his language game, to put it that way, like that we can't go beyond them in a way. If we do, then as you already pointed out, we moving into an ontological framework, or and Spinoza, I think, is not primarily interested in the ontological aspects. He tries to push away from there and looking at them, and so the modes are just like the relations of those on the level of the attributes of that we have. I don't know whether that I think the thing is that he also he uses the concepts differently from the like from his fellow philosophers, that he's really not interested in any essentialist kind of an approach, so I see him much more in the general move in the philosophy of history from substance to functionalism, like, but as a very, very early one, and interestingly him rather than Leibniz, which is also interesting because mathematically people would see it often differently. But so for him, the modes that that's just like the epistemological instrumentarium we have. I feel I'm not really maybe being able to fully, but I think that's what I read when I read him saying these sentences which are cracking one's brain. Like, what does he really mean? Like, you cannot break something from outside. I mean, Julia's going to ask in a moment a question. She has her approach to how to read death in that way, for Spinoza is very interesting.
So let's call on Julie.
Yes.
Unmute.
Well, it's lots of fun to be back at Vanderbilt to talk about Spinoza.
Hey.
It's been a long time.
You know this room very well. Yes.
Yes, I was thinking it's a very familiar locale. So rather than talking about insides and outsides, which I argue are ultimately imaginative boundaries in a relational ontology of modes, I wanted to ask you about the idea of consultation. I think one of the things that's interesting in your paper is you're clearly more of an ethics 4 reader of the ethics than, say, an ethics 1 reader of the ethics. And so you're kind of very anchored in the politics. So I thought, well, let's talk about the politics. And you make a parallel between the agreements of bodies and in physics and consultative bodies in politics. But there is a little bit of a difference in that the relations of bodies qua bodies are not governed by any particular teleology. And usually in political bodies, we're setting ends. And so, for example, in TTP 16, you get the image of the contract or the pact as a way human beings come together. And it seems to me that in politics, I mean, on the one hand, singular human beings find themselves in proximity. And so relations are happening and arrangements arise and conflicts arise. But it seems to me that we have to produce consensus. It doesn't just naturally happen all the time. And in fact, Spinoza is pretty honest about the need for repressive measures to produce consensus in some cases, right? We have not simply relations of agreement, not simply images, but actually force and threats. And rulers as well as citizens have to be kind of kept in line by that. And so I wanted to ask you about whether you see, whether you see democracy as a kind of like natural state in Spinoza. And if so, what exactly that means and how you think about the setting of ends in politics as a way of containing difference, but also in some sense repressing or reducing it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and also not an easy one. So I mean, it's certainly not a natural state in that it would just happen, or you're right in that if you think in terms of politics, and there is this issue of intentionality or so that comes in politics. The parallelism or that I was after is that both work, like in nature, how bodies work, human bodies like animal bodies, other bodies, and democracy, that they have, that the logic, the underlying logic of how difference and alterity operates is similar. It's that there's no ontological hierarchy of identity over difference. That's what I really wanted just to underline. When we go into and then what I was also interested in was that when, depending on, I mean, it's difficult how to define democracy, of course. And at that point, I was very much taken by Derrida's idea in Rogues to think of democracy as this continual rotation, which is another way to describe some kind of a particular relationality that I thought was something that Spinoza may be after here. The third thing is that is this way that Spinoza thinks in us, which I didn't talk much today, which is in a longer version that I'm trying to work on, is the idea of convenience, or like coming together in, which has to do also with political groups, like which produce identity, which is always based, I think, in Spinoza, as opposed to others, maybe in an awareness of that it's only possible through difference. Sort of like almost in an Adornian way of that the dissonance is the truth of harmony, that in a way the difference is actually what makes us be able to come together. And so in that way, I felt the idea of consensus in politics as being something that Spinoza is thinking through here, not in terms, again, of normativity. Is not interested in saying how this should be done, but like how, again, how the logic of the the relationality would work in this way. So yes, so they are different, of course, because but different in this complicated way that Spinoza defines the human humanity or human nature as being, of course, always not exempt of the laws and rules of like how nature works. We are not outside, we are not our own. But at the same time, of course, we are we can optimize that in some way. And so I think that is the yeah, so I think that's like, I think what I'm saying in other words is that the answer, what politics, what good politics, or what the politics that one of us or we would call good, is not like Spinoza isn't going there at this point in my discussion, which is different than from him eking out a theory of politics, of course, in the ethics, and then also in the TTP and the political treatise. But and there I would grant you, yeah, there would be maybe there would be maybe jumps, or there would be additional things coming in at some point that but I mean, what will connect them maybe would be the fact that relationality or difference would be always imagined as a generative rather than a deprivative or negative aspect. And so like in that way, again, we could say the flourishing of nature and the flourishing or thriving of human society and of an individual human, they would have some kind of structural similarities.
Yeah, if I could just say by way of follow-up, you know, there's a fascinating passage, I think it's in Political Treatise 5, where Spinoza is speaking about the tyrannical state. And in, you know, in the tyrannical state, everybody is so terrified that in effect they're dead, right? It's a wasteland and a desert unfit for human beings. So, you know, if you so reduce difference by terrifying everybody into immobilized submission, indeed what you have is wasteland. So I certainly agree that, you know, the difference is a generative principle. But I guess, you know, I'm just leery of claims, ways of reading Spinoza that make it seem as if some political formations are more natural than others. And it seems like when you go to the TTP and the TP, and there's a, you know, political leadership is a very subtle balancing act of keeping things enough together, but letting them also be enough different, right? Not transforming human beings into something else, but also not letting everything get out of hand.
If I can intervene here, again, privilege of it. I think that one of the things, the minute you move to the plane of immanence and deny any kind of essentialism, we are back to the same is always already the other. I mean, long before Derrida, we have got that in Aristotle, okay? In other words, the minute you move to a materialism, okay, there's a huge difference between sameness that is always already other, which is literally depends upon nature, as opposed to identity, which is idem ens, which depend upon a dualism. You'll end up with hugely different implications for politics as well. That for Spinoza, democracy, if we go back to one of my favorite moments in the TTP, as you know, that really the perfect theocracy. Okay, the only and perfect theocracy is the only perfect democracy. Why? Because they were absolutely equal, not just in terms of rank, okay, but in terms of economic equality, which is why I think he becomes so interesting to Marx. Economic equality, so that in the Jubilee year, if somebody would have had to alienate, okay, themselves or their possessions, in the Jubilee year, it will return back to them. So once we get to the TP, what we get is the democratization of every form of government. Okay, if it's a monarchy, sure, let them, they can worship whatever they want, but let them pay for it with their own right. Aristocracy, okay, let them distinguish themselves by their robes. Okay, but there's an absolute democratization at every level. So I think, but that will require a non-static nature, indeed, a question of immanence that is always already materially concrete, not contextualized in many ways, but concrete. In that sense, it would not take the same form. A lot will depend on existing institutions. Okay, so just putting that on the table. And just another little comment that I think would be of interest to everybody. There's a huge, very interesting literature on the question of dreams. Okay, like dreams, what's the relation between dreams, veridical dreams, divinations, and prophecy? And it goes all the way back to Galen. So just putting it on the table is something in terms of, and it's very much often in terms of striving. Okay, just putting that on the table. But anyway, but I think that we really, if we're going to emphasize the immanentist and the materialist, rather than a closed monism, then we can think democracy in a much more dynamic way. I didn't intend to silence people. Willi?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay, and now I want your reaction.
You mean with regard to the dreams question, or?
Oh, with regard to a non-closed system. In other words,
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And in terms of getting, and in that sense, thinking the materialism and as something by far more fluid and dynamic. So there's no single form of democracy. It will depend upon concrete material conditions that exist.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's right. And I mean, that's the interesting figure that I tried to get after in his the way he defines substance, which is like in that way strictly immanentist, that there's no external criteria to recur to. It has to, like, the criteria have to be reproduced each individual time from within, and so in that way also, even like for us, like we don't even have a, how should I say, criteria to judge different political situations unless from within again, because so you could describe it maybe as a complete system with no input, if you want, which is something I usually don't like to think of, but in that way it is like this is it has all to be generated from within. And exactly that makes it possible to actually take relations seriously, because they actually count now. They're not decoration or anything, but they are the actual thing. And so in that way, politics, and I think that's what he then really learned from Machiavelli. There's no external, it's all a dynamic spiel in a way. It is going from within, and the criteria are from within, and human nature is also part of that. So human nature, and so maybe it also de-dramatizes the way we think about politics today, because we think about politics about right and wrong, whereas for him it's a question of optimization. There's no teleological engagement in it, like will we ever get there, or have we been there and fallen down, or what is coming next? But it is just like here and now in way of this interrelational capacity, and it is so different than what we usually are accustomed to think. And I mean, that's the beauty of the crazy idea, which is so wonderful, of the theocracy in the TTP, because there says, of course, that works perfectly, because that is the only government where God takes over, which means the substance takes over, and there's no right or no way to appeal to it or for that to interfere. It's the totally closed immanent system, like as immanent as you ever could possibly think a political system. Whereas like if you think about and in that way also the totally material one, you know, where there's no external influencers, anything possible. Now you could.
What's interesting, yeah. What's interesting and perverse is that really the Jews elect God. God does not elect Jews. The Jews elect God, and in that sense, there's no human.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's the like as Adorno would say, the absolute block. There's the absolute blockage there. So like you cannot. There's legitimacy is completely internalized in that way. So it's in that way precisely not a Vatican type of or not a priest type of case, but it's precisely the very opposite in this crazy way. Yeah. I mean, one thing I was struck when I got along this is also that how it resonates, of course, with somebody like Montaigne, who has a completely different context and thinking. And also how it resonates like basically with dialogical thinking in very interesting, strange ways, or like what Simmel's idea of the interhuman. That's what I really got fascinated in here. And yeah.
Any other comments, questions?
I think Kim had raised his hand a while back.
Yes.
Okay, Kim, so please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed. I'm just wondering about what Spinoza doesn't mention so much about is about the epistemic faculty or epistemic and affective faculty of the non-human or non-sentient beings. I think Spinoza mentions just in E2P13S about everything in the nature is somehow animate, but he never mentions about the epistemic faculty of stone or bloodworm or state, etc. But the letter you mentioned, I think it's letter 32 to Oldenburg, is a really highly interesting when I'm thinking about this issue, because he, of course, it's kind of thought experiment with the worm in the blood, which is observing other particles, etc. But I think Spinoza indicates here that if there is an individuation, like being the whole, then there is a epistemic faculty like observation, or somewhat we cannot describe. So in this regard, I always thinking that we can draw from Spinoza a better version of relationalist or post-human or anti-anthropocentric political theory or ontology than the so-called object-oriented ontology or ontology, which is broadly debated nowadays, which is I think which is driven by Leibnizian inspiration, like monadology, or every object is substance, and they are all independent, and they are all equally existing, etc. So I was wondering about your interpretation of the epistemic and affective faculty of non-human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't go to that later though, because I think, in a book of mine, I have a chapter on the worm, and I call him the Spinoza's smart worm, which is supposed to be a pun on the smart weapons, and the idea being that I think it's a purely, it's a metaphor at that point. It's, I think, but if I would go to look at Spinoza and the animals, I would go to the ethics, and there would be a lot of interesting places. Also, the way he thinks, when he thinks about the famous poet who loses his mind, and the question at which point, you know, like what is, does so-called consciousness constitute itself? When he talks about the nature, what's the difference between a nature of a horse and a nature of a human? And I think, but then the nice thing in Spinoza is that it's very general, and it gives you then a lot of interesting creativity to extrapolate. I think it is in a guided way, it's there's definitely, like, the way he then thinks about how we relate to animals is really very different than from, let's say, maybe how Locke relates and others. He has so there would be a lot of possibilities. I would rather go there than to the worm, because I think how the letter works there is purely to basically, let's put it that way. I think it's what it really is. It's like introducing, and that's how I try to do it in the talk, how to introduce the observer in a system that I would argue has the observer, can only operate with the observer, but doesn't talk about the observer because it is still written in a more, like, in a mode of the 17th century, where you are precisely, where the observer becomes more and more important as a self-reflexive mode, but it's not yet, we don't yet have the Luhmannian type of level. And so I think that's what the worm does there, which is different from, but in the way, like, you could even go back to the dream with the Brazilian, the idea of that intersecting subjectivities or intersecting consciousnesses, that when I look at an animal and the animal looks at me, it's like, whether it's a human being or animal, anything that looks at me and I look back, like there's some kind of relationalities there, and they're different. And how they're different is then a question of again, a functionality, not of there's not a substance of it, but it's what we do with it. How do we relate to that relationality? And that's why you can have emphatic relationships to animals and humans, or you can't, depending on precisely how that relationality plays out with.
Interesting. Sorry, Maimonides explains, but it's not just Maimonides. It's the laws governing the slaughter of animals are intended to humanize us. Really
Right.
Interesting. And if you look at all the halachic texts, they're really intended to humanize us. It's not about the animals. It's about the animal which I am or I follow, if I'm to use Derrida's je suis. But that's the very question of the gaze comes here.
Right. No, and that's a nice way to put it, exactly, that it's not in that way a moral or ethical question, that whatever you do feeds back on what you are and who you are, which of course has a moral and ethical aspect, but that's just like one language to put it out. The other one would be Spinoza's, also of diminishing or increasing or decreasing your power, meaning power, like the more ethical you are in one kind of a register, the more powerful you are in another one. And that's exactly, that's the secret of relationality, that you are what you do in a way, and or like his essence. And this is, I have to admit that it's funny, like my stepdaughter asked me a few years ago, so what is essence for Spinoza? And I hadn't gone back really into Spinoza deeply at that point. So I was again fluttering, oh my God, until, you know, like, how do you define it? And I got sort of approximating it, but it's a very simple definition. It's the effects. Essence is the effects, and essence is precisely not what essence is traditionally defined for. It is almost pragmatist, but in a different way. You know, and so that's, in that way, that's what the relations are. It's just basic. You could also put it that way. It's a different way to describe reality, and that's where Spinoza anchors his transformative power. Whereas the Leibniz still is hooked into the old system, as or anybody else who thinks of difference as something that's that is existing there, but we should tolerate it because it's okay. Some people are like that and some are like that, rather than seeing that, no, that's not how it is. It's like how, like, the difference is between us, like what Simmel calls the interhuman. That's a Simmel sociological definition, which then migrates into Martin Buber and becomes the dialogical.
We are coming on the just 1 minute to 2:30, which is normally the end time. People can continue the conversation if they want, but I know some people may have other commitments. So any last questions, observations? Again, reminding you of our call for papers, and we can define modernity, I think, that fairly broadly. I think it takes us, it should take us back to Machiavelli. I mean, to me, the first modern, as many of you know, and definitely into almost all the way to critical theory. But any comments, observations? Emma, do you want to make any closing comments?
No, I just wanted to thank Willi again for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thank you, Willi. It was a wonderful, great beginning, okay? Or as we say in Arabic, siftah, okay? A great siftah, okay? And I hope to see you in our next talk, which hopefully we will, so please submit papers. Hey, Julie. Anyway, great.
Thank you very much also. And anybody who wants to write me, I'm really glad for any critique or ideas, because this is all still in the works.
Yeah, I'll send you some references to literature about dreams. I mean, they're fascinating. The question of the relation between dreams, divinations, and prophecy. And in particular, when they are understood in terms of striving, a certain kind of ethical or political striving. And there's terrific literature already from Galen on, but definitely also in Aristotle, in Maimonides, in Jasonides, etc. And I'm fascinated in terms of their relation.
Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending, and I look forward to seeing you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.